How should we remember Dick Cheney, who died Monday at the age of 84? As the Richard Nixon staffer who became the youngest White House chief of staff ever under Gerald Ford, or as a college dropout who would represent his state of Wyoming in Congress for a decade? As George H.W. Bush's defense secretary who helped engineer the Persian Gulf War to liberate Kuwait, or George W. Bush's vice president who pushed weapons of mass destruction to pursue war in Iraq, which, by the way, we're still paying for. As the ultimate Washington insider who counseled and guided generations of Republican politicians, or the private citizen who denounced President Trump as unfit for the Oval Office before stunning Americans on both sides by voting for Kamala Harris in 2024. Perhaps as a singular figure, the most powerful vice president in modern U.S. politics who never aspired to war. Joining us now, executive editor of The Nation, John Nichols. He is the author of The Rise and Rise of Richard B. Cheney, and staff writer for The Atlantic and former economics speechwriter for President George W. Bush, David Frum. You guys are going to come at this a bit differently, I imagine. David, I'd like to start with you. How will he be remembered?
I wrote for The Atlantic today that the beginnings of understanding him is to understand there is one man who was there all along. And some people who watch this program may like the 2024 Dick Cheney and dislike the 2004 Dick Cheney or the 1974 Dick Cheney, but they were the same person. He was someone who had a meteoric rise early. He became, as you say, White House chief of staff at an early age, because of the Watergate scandal that had wiped out or cleared away so many people who are more senior to him. And he came out of that experience believing in American strength, in American free markets, in world trade, and alliances. That's what he stood for as vice president. That's why he turned against Donald Trump in 2024.
All right, John, your version. Was he one man all along?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment that he was very much who he was. But I think there's a deeper question, of course, and that is, was he the right man? Was he the man that you wanted to be in the position he was in, particularly in the early 2000s, at a time when he was clearly the most powerful vice president in American history, but he was also someone who was determined, because of his neoconservative views, to direct U.S. foreign policy in a particular way. And I would argue that many of the policies that he stamped on the Bush-Cheney administration as a vice president so powerful that I think he did in many ways guide it, became real challenges, real burdens for the United States and the world.
I wonder how he can be considered, David, in this Republican Party today. Because we can talk about how the Democrats reacted to him and the dislike that Democrats had for Dick Cheney after 2004, after the invasion of Iraq, and all that fell from it. But there's also the Republican counter-reaction to him. And I talked about this with Doug Brinkley a little bit earlier. I was surprised in 2016 and 2015 to go to military strongholds and to hear Donald Trump rail against George W. Bush and Dick Cheney for the invasion of Iraq, and talking about how it was a lie, the WMDs were a lie, and hearing cheers from those military crowds. Do you think he has as much to do with the Republican Party as it stands now as he did with the Republican Party before 2016?
Dick Cheney, because of his Watergate experience, because of that, during coming into power at a time of American humiliation and weakness, believed in a strong presidency, but one guided by law. He was a constitutionalist. What under Donald Trump, the Republican theory of the presidency is a presidency unbound by law. And that's going to ultimately lead to a much weaker presidency. I mean, Donald Trump right now, it's interesting that in the same week as Dick Cheney died, this strong vice president, Donald Trump will go to the Supreme Court of the United States and say the president should have the power to declare an emergency for any reason, with nobody verifying whether it exists or not, whether being upset by a TV commercial from the province of Ontario counts as an emergency. And he should be able to impose tariffs, which is to say taxes, without regard to Congress. He should also be able to spend money by taking that tariff revenue and giving it to farmers without Congress. He should be able to withhold money without Congress. And so you have this, basically, there should be no more Article 1 in the Constitution. And Dick Cheney symbolized a different approach to the presidency, strong but legal. And that is what Republicans have been internally arguing about really since 2015. When Donald Trump claimed to propose the Iraq War in advance, that's just a lie. But in 2015, it was a lie that went unchecked. I think we are seeing as the country.
No, it went checked. It didn't go unrewarded. That's, I guess, the way that I would describe it, because we checked him on it.
Today we're on the verge of another war in the Caribbean. We're on the verge of a war in the Caribbean with no authorization by Congress, unlike the Iraq War, which was authorized by Congress, with no vote, no speech to the country. It is the most astonishing act of aggression that we've seen in our lifetimes.
I guess.
And Dick Cheney looks a little different.
I guess the question I have, or the argument that I think is worth making, is whether Dick Cheney has been a singular figure in American politics since the late 60s, one that is perhaps more influential, more significant for how we have lived since then and are living today in this political world than perhaps any. I mean, it would be hard to make the argument that he's more significant than any of the presidents, but the influence that he had and the decisions that he made and the path it set this country on and these two parties on, I think it's hard to diminish that, John.
I think it is very hard to diminish that. I might make a case for Mitch McConnell because Mitch McConnell, operating from the Senate, did an awfully lot to define the Supreme Court and, frankly, as you'll recall, to prevent accountability for Donald Trump. And so I think that you have several of these people who've been very influential. Cheney's hugely influential. And while I have great respect for my colleague here, I disagree. I think Dick Cheney did a lot that built the imperial presidency. And it may be true that he had some respect for the Constitution, but there was a great disregard for the rule of law, a great disregard for transparency. If you look at his response to the debate about Iraq, if you look at his disregard for legitimate congressional questioning of that war, if you look at his response to the Senate Intelligence Committee memo and report on torture, I just think you have to say that Dick Cheney in many ways laid the groundwork for the sort of imperial presidency that we now object to.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you for coming on and helping me understand the place Dick Cheney is going to hold in our history. Appreciate it.